Don Garlits is widely recognized as the greatest drag racer of all time, and that's something that even his contemporaries largely agree on, which is certainly a rarity when it comes to a figure in any sort of competitive sport. I'm among those who also think that he's the greatest there's ever been as well. My belief in that fact is the basis of me making this piece. Don Garlits was not made alone. In fact, through a career that spanned the decades and seemed to age like fine wine, he was a man motivated by rivalries. As we know, people find motivation through any number of a zillion different ways, but for Don Garlits, it was the identification of people as benchmarks to which he'd measure his own ability against, and he didn't quit until he surpassed them and moved on to the next one. It's a pattern you can see for decades in his competitive drag racing life. All patterns have to start somewhere, and this one begins with a wiry Armenian World War II veteran who operated a service station and speed shop in Detroit, and most importantly, could drive the wheels off a Top Fuel dragster. The man's name was Serop Postoian. His friends and mostly everybody else called him Setto, and Serop Postoian was as good a drag racer as the world had ever produced by the early 1950s. He's in the Drag Racing Hall of Fame, as well as the Michigan Motorsports Hall of Fame, and you've likely never heard of him, until now. As I like to do, I want to share the sources of where the vast majority of information in this video is coming from. There's loads of clips from various newspapers that span coast to coast. Of course, lots of reference in the classic issues of Drag News, Robert C. Post's epic drag racing history book High Performance, the Don Garlits and Brock Yates crafted book called King of the Dragsters, Wally Park's 1966 tome entitled Drag Racing Yesterday and Today, and finally, Arnie and Bernie Schumann's Cool Cars and Square Roll Bars, which chronicles the early days of hot rodding and drag racing in New England. Let's just say there's not one place with a lot of Setto Postoian history, so multiple sources were definitely the order of the day. Now, to prove a point about rivalries and the rise of Don Garlits, when he first started competing locally in Florida in the 1950s, there was a guy named Charlie Hogan who had a roadster powered by a Lincoln V12 engine, and the thing was untouchable. This guy was so unbeatable, they called him the King. And this guy would not give Don Garlits, try as he might, the time of day to look at his own rough-and-tumble racer, and that was enough for Garlits. To quote him in his book, King of the Dragsters, quote, "I vowed to beat the King if it would be the last thing I ever did." End quote. It took him a couple of tries and multiple changes to his car, but he finally did it. Incidentally, Charlie Hogan's son grew up to work for Don Garlits as a young man, and eventually that same man evolved into one of the greatest Top Fuel crew chiefs of all time, tuning Steve Torrance to 4 straight Top Fuel NHRA championships between 2018 and 2022. His name, of course, is Richard Hogan. That's incredible, right? Through 1956 and early 1957, Garlits raced in Florida and read every drag racing publication he could get his hands on. He followed the progress of the great racers across the country and tried to match it himself. He built himself a very basic dragster out of a set of 1930 Chevrolet frame rails, powered it with a junkyard 354 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi, and by trial and error, he figured out how to run a pretty decent percentage of nitromethane in the tank. Brimming with confidence, he and his brother Ed decided to commit themselves to race at the ATAA World Series of Drag Racing in Illinois that summer. The Automotive Timing Association of America was the biggest drag racing sanctioning body at this time, believe it or not, and that race was one of 2 national meets that existed at this point in history. The other, of course, was the NHRA Nationals. Now, with the NHRA having decided to disallow nitro fuel at their races and the ATAA allowing it at theirs, it was a natural choice for where Don and Ed Garlits wanted to go drag racing, and they wanted to head to the World Series. The 1957 World Series of Drag Racing brought cars from all corners of the nation. Ohio's Arfons brothers showed up with their massive Allison aircraft-powered Green Monster, the Cook and Bedwell dragster, which was the fastest car in the short history of the sport at that time, and the machine of a wiry Armenian from Detroit, as Garlits described him, Serop Postoian. He was officially standing in the presence of giants and doing his best to be one himself, along with his brother Ed. Postoian made a name for himself as the runner-up at the 1956 running of the World Series of Drag Racing and being one of the first men to ever barnstorm the central and eastern United States with a dragster. He was one of the first, maybe even predating Garlits, traveling pro. It was the next evolutionary step for a man who was seemingly on an invisible collision course with his much younger rival in weight. Setto Postoian was a gifted mechanic who was working for Ford before being drafted into the war effort. Now, he spent nearly 4 years overseas in the service of the country before he came home. Upon coming home, he opened a service station in Farmington, Michigan, and before long expanded the business into the chassis and body repair industry. Through buying equipment and kind of learning the ropes, it got him into contact with the people at Bear Manufacturing. And this led into a short stint as a crew guy on an Indy 500 entry that the company fielded in the early 50s. As he was spending months of May at the Speedway, he actually met a young racer named Jack McGrath. And Jack was from the West Coast. He was a dominating midget and jalopy competitor who had actually garnered enough attention for his driving skills that he was a multiple-time podium finisher at the Indy 500. He went home with McGrath after the race and spent 6 weeks in California, immersed in hot rodding culture. He went street racing with McGrath and met people like Ed Iskandarian and Joe Pisano. He went home to Farmington, Michigan, expanded the business again, opening a speed shop with a desire, and very strong desire, to go drag racing. Setto would race flathead-powered hot rods and rails for the entirety of his short career up to the 1957 World Series. Fast for what they were and competitive against a plethora of other people which he raced barnstorming around, the sport was changing very quickly. A flathead Ford, no matter how built it was really no match for a properly set-up Chrysler Hemi in the chase for top eliminator honors. Knowing that, he built a new car to debut at the race with a fresh chassis and a big booming Chrysler between the frame rails. He came out of the gate flying. The car went 936 at 158.17 miles an hour in an early test pass at the event. The Cook and Bedwell car, running a taller gear ratio intended for more top-end speed, did just exactly that, running 163.63 miles per hour. Why would they do that and give up some ET? Well, the event paid a bonus of $1,000 for top speed of the meet, and these guys were clearly there to get paid. On the flip side, Don Garlits was in the dumps. His car was running horribly. It could not go any quicker than 12:43 at 133.33 miles an hour. Now, amazingly, Emery Cook of the Cook and Bedwell team, the all-dominating, nationally known, speed record-holding masters of the sport, approached Garlits and asked what the trouble was. When Garlits told him he was running 25% nitro, Cook almost laughed him out of the place and said he needed to step it up. Garlits asked how much, and Cook said to 95%. Almost choking on the number, Garlits overhauled his entire fuel system to handle the necessary increase in volume for the big load of nitro, and he did it in kind of a 1 to 2 day thrash using jerry-rig parts and whatever he could get his hands on. The result? The car was now running close to 150 miles per hour, and his next round opponent just so happened to be Cook and Bedwell. As Garlits described it, the fun and light tone and the help had all but disappeared. He looked over and saw the icy eyes of Emery Cook in the dragster. There was no smile anymore. There was just intense focus. The focus was so intense that Garlits foul started. Now, you have to remember, at this time in drag racing, drivers were given multiple foul starts before being disqualified. It's not like today when you turn on the red light on the Christmas tree and immediately lose. Back then, you get another swipe at it. So he took another swipe at it. Incredibly, on that swipe, he ran 992 at 150.21 miles per hour to beat his heroes, Cook and Bedwell. Those guys had assumed Garlits would be soft on elapsed time, and they left their taller gear ratio in, which did net them a big speed of 160 miles per hour, but it killed the ET. They only ran 1012. They got their $1,000 bonus, but they did not get a round win or a shot at top eliminator. Elated and blown away that he had been able to race and beat his heroes, Garlits was absolutely overjoyed. He then learned his next opponent was Setto Postoian, who dispatched him with relative ease. Postoian would then go on to win the entire event, garnering the money and the instant fame that came with it. But Garlits had proven himself that he was as good as the best in the country, and like Charlie the King Hogan, he was dead set on beating Setto Postoian, if it was the last thing he ever did. Going home from the race, Garlits and his brother Ed upgraded his car from end to end. Gear ratio, camshaft, intake manifold, carburetors. If you could improve it, these guys did. Then on November 10th, 1957, he went to Brooksville, Florida, and tore off an 8.79-second run at a calculated speed of 176.4 miles per hour. This was the fastest speed anyone had ever traveled in the quarter mile by a long shot. Later that day, he managed a high 8 at 163.99, which gave some indication that he could at least back up the elapsed time. The run was the Garlits shot heard round the world. It was promoted by Isky cams, which he used, Bruce tires, which he used, Crowler intake manifolds, which he used, and by the way, Ed Iskandarian provided him his first sponsorship with money for tires, spark plugs, and some nifty t-shirts for an upcoming event, which would be the last of the year, a race called the International Timing Association meet. Based in Chester, South Carolina, Bob Osicki oversaw the ITA, or the International Timing Association, and it was a formidable presence. It was in league with the ATAA and the NHRA at this time in drag racing history, and they had stout payouts at this event. The meet drew the likes of Setto Postoian, the Arfons brothers, Bob Sullivan from Kansas City, and a whole bunch of others. After losing the brakes at 166 miles per hour and going off the end of the racetrack, Garlits was there cleaning the mud off his car and stood to watch Setto Postoian run 169 miles per hour. The weekend seesawed back and forth between the two men, and in the end, Garlits had top eliminator as well as top time of the meet. He had run 8:95 at 170, and he figured that the haters were finally silenced after seeing those numbers. In fact, they weren't. Not only that, they got louder, and the group grew far, far larger. The Californians didn't believe a lick of Garlits' performance, and they were not shy about saying so, both public and otherwise. Postoian, having lost to Garlits, was growing frustrated with the constant string of headlines attributed to him and his growing fame when he had been at this longer than Garlits had and still toiled in relative obscurity. And he was kind of just as fast, if not faster, outside of that, 176-mile-an-hour run. As all drag racers did at this time, they took their winter revising, changing, and upgrading their race cars. If you didn't, someone else would, and then he'd start the next season behind. 1958 would dawn, and an opportunity that would change Garlits' life landed in his mailbox. The Red River Timing Association of Texas offered Garlits $450 in appearance money to race at their Invitational Regional Championship. Not only would he get paid to show up, he'd finally have a shot at the California guys. I mean, at least some of them who were questioning his performance and mocking him. This was an all-star field. It drew in racers like the 1956 NHRA Nationals champ Melvin Heath, Bobby Langley of Texas, the Speed Sport Roadster of Arizona, the former Cook and Bedwell car, and a host more, and all of them were effectively lined up to race Garlits. Sure, they had to race each other, but that loudmouth from Florida was the big prize. Garlits ripped off a 9:28 at 160.71 miles per hour on Sunday morning as a final warm-up run, and that run sent shockwaves through the pits. He raced Bobby Langley of Texas first and beat him by a train length, running 9:17 at 161.29. On a solo run later in the day, he went 9:12 at 162.74, and that set up a top eliminator final against the Speed Sport Roadster and Lyle Fisher. This was effectively the nastiest car in the country. In an absolute squeaker, Garlits' low 9-second run at 161.87 miles per hour got him the win, got him the dough, and got the target on his back enlarged even more. Back in Florida, obsessed with going faster, Garlits ran at Kissimmee Dragway, and in a single day, he made more headlines. He ran 8:97, 8:99, and 8:99 again to become the first person to ever make 3 sub-9-second passes on the same day. Once again, the drag racing newspapers ate it up, and once again, Postoian and the rest of the mob seethed. His next race was the ITA International meet, and it was a final round top eliminator showdown between he and Setto Postoian again. A new engine Setto had put in the car blew up before the run, allowing Garlits to handily mangle a replacement runner, and Postoian became very public in his opinion that Garlits' car was incapable of running 176 miles per hour, and all of this was a fabrication. For all of his anger, though, Postoian was now being booked as often as Garlits was as a traveling act. They were among drag racing's elite, and east of the Mississippi, they were the two uncontested greatest drag racers in the land. The Californians wanted a second shot at Garlits, so another invitational meet was organized in Houston, Texas. This time it was Pete Ogden, the Cagle and Callahan car, Bobby Langley, and Jack Ewell all lined up to thump the Floridian. Postoian was not invited. One by one, day by day, Garlits eliminated them all, systematically closing with a stoppage of Pete Ogden by running 9:13 at 165.24 miles per hour. For kicks, he made one last run after eliminations were over and ran 9:12 at 166.35 miles per hour. Another win, but another race where 176 miles per hour wasn't achieved, and the chatter continued to get louder. A month after Houston, it was time for the 1958 ATAA World Series. Garlits, despite his amazing successes, was still seen as an underdog to the battle-tested previous year winning driver, Setto Postoian. Setto had been running his own breakneck match racing tour around the country to prepare for this event as well. Early in time trials, Postoian ran a stunning 8:99 at 167.43 miles per hour. It set the tone for the entire race. With some tuning, Garlits made a sideways, kind of half-out-of-control run, netting a speed of 170.13, effectively answering Postoian's earlier rip down the drag strip. Now, during the last day of test runs before eliminations, Garlits blew the clutch straight out of his car. Thankfully, he did have a very small, kind of flimsy, but effective clutch shield that protected him when this happened. Now, a man named Dick Keller volunteered to drive 125 miles to Chicago from Cordova, Illinois, to get him another one. He went and made the round trip while the guys tore the car apart. They installed the clutch at dawn before eliminations, and the car was ready just in time. The result? A 9:07 at 172 miles per hour, which was an all-time event record. And minutes later, Postoian went 9:06. They both raced to what seemed like an inevitable final. While helmeting up, Garlits was told that Postoian needed more time to make repairs for his damaged car. There was a problem with the oiling system. Garlits waited a while and then asked if he could make a test run because he figured he'd have extra time while the work was being completed on Postoian's car. The test run yielded a 9:06, which matched Setto's low ET of the race. Now, barely back to the starting line after the test run, race officials said the final needed to be run immediately because they were losing daylight. Garlits was nervous. He had a brand new clutch in the car, which had just had no time to cool off after slipping its way down the drag strip to that 172-mile-an-hour run. But, given no time to make any changes, it was now or never. He staged up next to his rival and a guy who was as intense about winning the race as he was. The two cars left identically off the starting line, and they were charging down the racetrack at what seemed like a dead heat until Garlits' hot clutch proceeded to explode again in spectacular fashion. For the second time in as many days, his rudimentary clutch shield saved him from harm a second time. Setto won Top Fuel Eliminator and then finished the job for the Top Eliminator title. He had won back-to-back World Series of drag racing events, and that was a massive feat in the sport at this time. Larger than that, for the second time in a row, he had taken his most intense rival to the mat on the largest stage in the sport in its most critical moment. Ed and Don Garlits actually stayed near Chicago for a couple of weeks after the World Series before driving to Kansas City for the AHRA Nationals in 1958. He absolutely decimated the field there, running easy 950s at 160 miles an hour to take care of business of what was a true walkover of a race and probably one of the easiest paychecks he ever earned at a racetrack. Returning home, the fall was once again time to get back into Florida, and that meant time to take a trip to his happy hunting ground of Brooksville. Now, this trip had paid Bobby Langley, the great Texas Top Fuel racer, to come and challenge Garlits. Garlits had asked that an NHRA official be present at this match race to certify the clocks. This is the track he had run the 176-mile-an-hour pass at, and knowing that he was always fast at this particular facility, he wanted somebody there to keep an eye on it because he knew in the cool air of fall, things should go pretty well. So the NHRA obliged, and it's a good thing that they did. With 100% nitro in the tank and crisp fall air, along with plenty of traction on the concrete runway, magic happened. 8.90 seconds at 180 miles per hour. This was a seemingly impossible drag racing barrier, and it had been met and broken. He then ran 8.67 at 176.50 on the same day. He then defeated Langley in the final of their match race, running 9.04 at 169.81, with the car back down and tamed down to keep the engine in one piece. As you can imagine, the winter was very short because the match racing season kicked off the first thing when January flipped over into the next year. At the time, it seemed like every track in the country was trying to book in Garlits and Postoian to battle it out in front of their fans, and they were booked from the first week of the new year, but their most major coup was not going to be a race against each other. It was going to be a race against the world. The Californians were finally making it worth their while to enter enemy territory, and they both went in March. Garlits was guaranteed $2,000 to race in Bakersfield for the first Fuel and Gas Championships, a race that we now know as the March Meet, one of the great legacy events that's been happening in the history of the sport. So he's going to collect 2 G's just for showing up and race at that one. Then when he goes to the King Don and then Chandler, Arizona tracks, he would pick up additional money for a total value of $5,000 paid before prize money. That's about $50,000 in today's bucks, before he actually won anything or earned anything on top of it. As one would expect with such a tall challenge in his sights, the brothers rebuilt the entire car and got it all in tip-top shape before they set out for California. Their plan was to stop in Houston, Texas at their friend Don Stillman's house, where they would meet up with Setto Postoian. They actually met up with Setto Postoian and a third guy at Don Stillman's house. Well, that third guy was more of a kid, actually, a 17-year-old in a 1957 Chevy convertible who loved drag racing and wanted a fuel dragster more than anything in the world. His name was Connie Coletta. The 3 cars, 2 quilling race cars and 1 with the top down, convoyed into the belly of the beast. And the Bakersfield race was a disaster. Garlits and Postoian showed up with carbureted dragsters when everybody else had swapped blowers on. Well off the pace and working his equipment to the point of destruction, Garlits blew up an engine. Unable to find a suitable replacement overnight, they swung a stock short block into the chassis, which blew the rods out of it before it actually got to the starting line in the first round, and the crowd was elated. The East Coast guy was humiliated, and Postoian fared no better but got a little less wrath from the crowd. It was the worst possible outcome for Garlits, and the one moment he could have stood up and showed everybody, he failed miserably. And Postoian was in the same boat. Did they quit and go home? Absolutely not. Both men immediately went to work installing superchargers on their engines, and they did the work at the same time at the same shop. Now, the second race of their trip was at King Don, California. Slipping his weight into the 8s at 165 miles an hour was the best that Garlits had going into eliminations. And amazingly, it ended up being Garlits and Setto Postoian in the Top Fuel final. They had both worked their way through it. Beating Setto, Garlits was now up for the top eliminator honors against Tony Waters, who had runner-up at the Bakersfield race just a week or 2 before. Waters, who had been one of the loud proponents of bringing Garlits to California to humiliate him, was squashed like a bug. Beating his longtime rival Postoian and then bumping off Tony Waters was the icing on the cake for Don Garlits, and there was 1 stop left in Chandler, Arizona. Now, a whole contingent of Californians decided to show up at Chandler, Arizona, and they did so with vengeful intent. Setto's blower drive failed, downing him early. Ted Sear went 178 miles an hour in an intimidating gesture toward Garlits, and the man they jokingly called Tampa Dan weaved his way through the field and coasted to a final round win when his blower drive failed as well, and his opponent was too far back to catch him. Garlits and Postoian were now making so much money match racing that they were incredulous. The California trip had made them heroes back east, so the strip operators wanted them badly. Tracks from Texas to Maine and all points in between booked them in for as many weeks as they'd take. One of those tracks was Chester, South Carolina, home of those ITA races that Garlits had been competing at. He was there to make the match race, and he set up for a test run. He went 177 miles per hour. He went back and talked it over with Ed and decided that they needed a little more nitro in the tank to go 180. On the ensuing run, the engine backfired, blew the supercharger off, and was now bathing Don Garlits in fire at over 150 miles per hour. His hands unprotected, his face only covered by goggles and a leather jacket his wife Pat had given him over his trunk, he was severely and disfiguringly burned, it appeared. Despite some chipper-sounding news stories after the fire, this was very, very bad. He spent weeks in the hospital in incredible pain, had a very long recovery process, and by all accounts, including his own, Don Garlits was done drag racing. So he thought. His old friend Art Malone changed his mind. Malone was a decorated stock car driver, already had the reflexes to drive anything with wheels on it, and could quickly pick up the dragster driving duties, at least that's what he told Don Garlits. The sheer number of bookings and the money on the table made Garlits reconsider quitting. He agreed to go on the road with Malone, and all the tracks wanted was his name and him present. They really didn't care about him driving the race car. As long as they'd be able to promote the fact that Don Garlits was on the property and his car was there, they didn't care who was in the seat. Now, after getting out of the hospital, they took Art out to the track to test and see if he could actually drive the dragster. 3 165-mile-per-hour runs later, they were in the drag racing business together. Now, the first stop they had to make was an interesting one in Sanford, Maine. They drove up the eastern seaboard with Garlits coaching Malone the whole way about driving, what other drivers' tendencies were, what kind of tricks people would try to play, how to race Setto Postoian specifically, and everything he may need to know when he was strapped into the race car. Arriving in Sanford, Maine, the Speed Sport Roadster ran 182.92 miles an hour, setting a new drag strip speed record. Malone went out and then went 183.66. He then also took out Setto in the process in what was a doubly interesting moment because something had actually changed. Postoian was not even trying to be chummy anymore. He had his brow furrowed and was racing Garlits and Malone like sworn mortal enemies. The pair of cars ran around the country trading blows and race wins back and forth. Make no mistake about it, this was the greatest two-man rivalry the sport had ever seen, and the track operators were loving the crowds and the profits it was drawing. Now, Garlits had to have plastic surgery done on his hands, and so that meant Malone had to travel by himself to Dunkirk, New York, and again, this is in 1959, for a match race against Setto. The track used an air hose timing system. Now, you ever see the hoses on a road when you're driving down the street and they use them to count traffic as the cars run them over? That was a type of timing system that was actually used at this drag strip. And it was not good. Art Malone was clocked in 1959 at Dunkirk, New York, as running 195.653 miles per hour. On his next run, the car went 170, and the speeds were less consistent than that. But unfortunately for Garlits and Malone, Setto beat them to the finish line in every attempt at Dunkirk. Sure, he ran some big speeds, but Setto Postoian owned them in the elapsed time department, but did that really matter? Now, Garlits himself was dubious about the 195-mile-an-hour speed, but his sponsors began promoting it relentlessly. The headlines hit, and finally, Setto Postoian had had enough. He had reached his breaking point, and he flipped out, buying this advertisement in drag news, inventing his spleen at Garlits. Now, if you don't think these guys had some deep-seated personal stuff going on, listen to this. Garlits, you are a fraud. It's no wonder they call you Swamp Rat. You're in this sport to get what you can. You don't care what you do or what trouble and dissension you cause just so you can make a buck out of it. Why should you be paid to appear at a strip and then run the guy who works for their parts and then have to compete against a bona fide professional? Why should you be paid $4,000 plus motel expenses to appear and race at Fremont, California? If you're the big deal you're supposed to be, then why not put up the $4,000 for top eliminator and then you just win it anyway? Do you think you risk more than anyone else? Do you think you're better than the West Coast who towed east? Your 181 mile per hour was supposed to be official because there was an AHRA regional advisor in attendance. Why didn't you tell the people that you were the regional advisor and you were driving the car? You're trying to get a phony 195-mile-an-hour pass made official, and I was there too. We ran on rubber hoses just like a service station gong. You shoot your mouth off about how the quarter mile is getting too dangerous and we should all go eighth mile. Yet you turn around and stick the green kid in the fastest car running the biggest engine you ever put together, blown yet. You were supposed to have turned an 823 with a speed of 178, yet 3 weeks later at a supposedly 195 miles per hour, your ET stunk. Explain it, pal. If you can wheedle your way into offices and get press agents to make you the fair-haired god of drag racing, more power to you. But on the strip, I beat you 4 times now, you and the green kid both. And I say I'll beat you again and again because you're nothing but a hound dog. Even another comparatively green driver beat you too for national honors, Chris Karamessinas. You come up with sickening excuses, and if excuses counted, then no one has ever been beat, ever. I'm looking for my 5th, 6th, 7th, etc. win over the, quote, record holder, end quote. Any strip operator wishing to see a true race and not a one-sided contest, please contact Setto Postoian, Detroit, Michigan. Not only did Setto attack Garlits personally, questioning his motives for racing, his integrity, the money he was making, the competition he was facing, and all that wild stuff, he did something far more significant in this ad that was used to attack Don Garlits. He coined a name. Swamp Rat. No one had ever called Don a swamp rat or the swamp rat in public before, and now we know him in modern times as Big Daddy Don Garlits, and all of his cars are known as various numbers of a swamp rat. Amazingly, even if people were calling him this behind his back, he had never heard it or seen it until this ad, and he immediately owned it. He painted the rat on the car, Malone painted the green kid on his helmet, and as we'd say today, they leaned into all of it, to the point where he copyrighted the swamp rat name. The best part of all this is that the guys had a slew of match races still booked against each other through the rest of 1959. Garlits and Malone went to California again and simply flattened everybody in their way. At Riverside, it was basically no contest. To start the year, an entire state had challenged this guy, and now they had no answer for him. The early part of 1960 was much the same as 1959. Match races, a close shave at actually winning Bakersfield, then losing to Mickey Thompson in the final, more California success after the race, and much more match racing itself. By the middle of the year, the Garlits-Malone partnership was beginning to fray. Both had begun to have different ideas about how to actually run their race car, and the trouble with splitting the money up became a larger issue, with Garlits now having children and more bills to pay at home, and the idea that Garlits kind of knew he should be back in the race car driving it now. And then there was a true showdown with Setto Postoian in July at his home track. Now at this time, Malone was still driving the race car, and it was really the tail end of these two guys racing together, so there was tension internally, and there was certainly tension externally when you add in the fact that Setto was trying to defend his honor and his home racetrack. You have all the elements in place for some fireworks. Now, by this time, Setto had lost a step to the Garlits operation. Their relentless schedule, larger income, and lack of any other real business but the car itself had given them an advantage. Setto was still close, but he wasn't close enough to make headlines, set records, or outrun them anymore. He would, though, make the best stand he possibly could at his home racetrack. Or not. Art Malone completely annihilated Postoian at this particular race, making a near incredibly perfect lap of 190.26 miles per hour. Setto was brought to the point of mania and having to witness this at his home track, and he vowed to take the record back if it was the last thing he ever did. Sound familiar? The following week, Garlits and Malone went to Saginaw, and Setto returned to Detroit Dragway with a hopped-up car, now sporting wire wheels in the front to save weight like the Garlits entry. On a tire-smoking, hard-charging run, a large gust of wind came across the racetrack. Well, Setto was close to the finish line, and that gust of wind blew him off course. A wire wheel failed, and he suffered a crash of epic proportion. He was gravely injured, with a broken back, multiple broken ribs, broken legs, and enough bad result that he would never drive a fuel dragster again. As Garlits wrote in his book with Brock Yates, quote, "With his retirement came the loss of one of the most formidable competitors I ever faced." End quote. This was the instant end to one of the most important early top fuel racing careers the sport ever knew. But it was not the end of his life, or the end of his connection to Don Garlits. Setto would actually work for Garlits when he had his race shop and business up in the Detroit area for several years in the late 60s. Eventually, he would go to work at General Motors, where he spent about 2 decades working in the technical center. He retired from GM and lived his final years in Michigan, passing in the middle 1990s. Setto Postoian is a name all drag racing fans should know because he was the name that drove Don Garlits to work and obsess and get better and faster. His was the name that caused the greatest of all loss of sleep to Garlits, the name that drove him to spend extra hours at the shop and to get nervous when he pulled into the gates of a racetrack. Don Garlits is a human without compare. Certainly a drag racer that has no equal or anybody really in the same realm of influence. Art Malone has passed away, but his life was also amazing. He not only drove top fuel cars, but stock cars, and even competed at the Indy 500. He and Bob Osicki of the ITA actually broke the 180-mile-per-hour speed barrier at Daytona International Speedway in a wild-blown hot rod known as the Mad Dog. If you want to know that story, you can find it in my Dorkomotive podcast series if you search for it. I say Setto Postoian had a huge role in making Don Garlits. Sure, the West Coasters gave him grief, but Setto pressed him to become better week in and week out. Without Setto and the experience of his competition, does he win anything out west? Without Setto, does he have the drive to keep going with Art Malone in the car? Without Setto, do we see him achieve what he continued to achieve in the ensuing decades? I think the answer is without Setto, Don Garlits would have been great, but not the greatest. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more drag racing, mechanical, gearhead, compelling, and, at least I think, interesting history. See you next time.